Hello and welcome to this Facebook Live. I'm here to talk to you about the textbook, Key Questions in Second Language Acquisition, which is published by Cambridge University Press. So if you have a question, this is supposed to be interactive. So if you've got questions, feel free to pop them in the comments and I'll reply now or later on as they come in. So just to briefly introduce myself and then we'll start talking about the book. I'm Megan Smith. I'm a assistant professor of linguistics and TESOL at Mississippi State University. So just a little bit of background on how I got into second language acquisition research, which is my primary area of research. I did an undergraduate degree in linguistics, and at the same time I was studying Japanese, and I had experience studying Japanese both in second language classrooms and in kind of study abroad immersion programs. And my linguistics study got me interested in language acquisition because it just kind of felt like the system is so complicated. How does anybody learn this? And language learning, and particularly second language learning, seemed impossible. And certainly I knew people who really struggled with it, but that's also learnable. So that's sort of how I got into this. And my primary area of interest is second language syntax and processing. And I'm also interested in how learners interact with the input that they do receive and what they do with that and how the system sort of builds over time. So like I said, I'm here to talk to you about our book, Key Questions in Second Language Acquisition, which I co-wrote with Bill Van Patten and Alessandro Benatti. I got sort of tapped to do this because I'm the only one of the three of us who's taught this book and been using it in the classroom. And I did the same scramble that many people did in the spring to put classes online. So it's about me and sort of the context for this. The book, so when I was finishing my doctoral work, Bill and I had several conversations about a couple of things that we saw as like problematic or challenging for people kind of entering the field and then also for publishing in the field more generally. And the biggest thing is around kind of understanding what questions drive the field, and that leads into this ability or lack thereof or difficulty contextualizing and contextualizing research and then therefore synthesizing it into larger questions. And so we wanted something that would kind of provide that context and structure both for newcomers to the field and for instructors teaching. So our goals kind of were to have something that was comprehensive. So we did want to provide a general oversight or overview of what we thought the main ideas or main questions in the field were without worrying about being exhaustive. So we have made, we've tried to like kind of zoom out and take a bigger, broader perspective and not tried to hit every sub area of SLA research. And we also wanted to provide some historical context for some of the major research questions because it's easy for newcomers to the field and new scholars to get sort of caught up in all of the new research that's coming out, which is great. There's nothing wrong with reading new stuff. But the problem is that everybody's time is limited. And there's some really seminal early work that a lot of people just know about because they read summaries here or there. And so we wanted to sort of contextualize things there with some of the older historical work. So that was where the book came from. And I think, and that's where we got our sort of framework for key questions. And so each chapter deals with a question in SLA research. And then also goes into some of the research. So just personally, both from teaching this book and working on this book for me as a sort of new scholar, I was in my first year out of grad school when we started working on it, was a great exercise in stepping back from the dissertation and the narrow focus and focusing kind of on broader questions and revisiting some of these things. And it helped me solidify some of my ideas. And then teaching this book, I think, has been so some of the things I've seen in teaching this book is that I think it really helps students to have this framework of like, okay, there's this question and there's this question. And it helps me think about what to focus on in the classroom and what not to focus on in the classroom. So some of the features of this book that I find helpful and that we included are, we've tried to be as accessible as possible in terms of our language use. So this is not a scholarly monograph, and we've tried to write it that way, both in terms of not assuming background knowledge on the part of the reader and also taking a little bit more of a casual tone. And in fact, last semester when I was teaching this book, I went to class after their first reading assignment. And I always do this just to get a sense of where my students are, but I asked how they found the reading. And one of my students said, oh, finally, it was like reading English again. So I think, at least judging by that student, we've succeeded in our attempt to be as kind of as accessible as possible. We have book or call out boxes in the text that try to highlight the main ideas so that you can flip back through it and pull out what we anyway see as main ideas, and also to help orient the reader towards the main ideas. We have included sort of consider this boxes at various points in the text to both provide a break in reading and also to help the reader or the student stop and think about what they just read. So, you know, some support in the text for critical reading or engaged active reading. Those could also be used. I use those sometimes for discussion questions in class as well. We've also included exemplary study boxes where a study that we think is particularly important or that we talk about in the text will pull out and give kind of bullet point overview of the study. So we'll include research questions, participants, materials, findings, and some discussion. And those are sort of like all of the information you'd put in a paragraph summary in bullet points. Again, to help students digest the key elements of research. Every chapter includes a list of both references and readings, so readings and articles relevant to the ideas in the chapter. And then at the end, we have follow-up sections that include discussion questions and, depending on the chapter, possible ideas for mini research projects. So I want to talk next about what features the textbook has that supports distance teaching. But before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I approach the class when I teach out of this book. So then it will contextualize sort of what I would do for distance teaching. So when I teach this book, I organize my class around each of our key questions. So question 1 is, what are the origins of SLA as a research field? Question 2 is, I don't remember what question 2 is. What does development look like? I did know that. Question 3 is, what are the roles of input and output, and so forth. And so I will assign as the first reading assignment in a unit, the chapter to sort of orient people to it. And then I'll follow that up with, depending on how much time I have, 1 to 3 articles that address that question, that focus specifically on that question. So for instance, chapter 2, what does development look like, looks at stages of development and acquisition orders, or orders of acquisition. And so they read that chapter, we talk about that chapter, and then the next 2 articles that we read are morpheme order studies. So I assign a Dulé and Burt paper, and I assign the Luke and Shirai paper from 2009 that's kind of looking at the morpheme order studies again. And so that my goal for this is that they have some background knowledge now when they go read research, and they can pull out the key parts of the research. But then, of course, the research articles are also a lot. I have primarily undergraduates. Sometimes they're split level class, so beginning MA students. But for most of my students, this is the first time that they've read linguistically oriented and or empirical research. And so reading the research is a big jump for them. So I think that the textbook chapter provides like the content background, and then I do a lot in class to help them break down the articles. So I don't usually lecture. We structure our class discussions on, okay, what is this idea? So what are natural sequence, or what are morpheme orders? How do they pick the functors? What do you think about, like, what is the methodology that they used? How did they do that? Like, how did they actually get their data? How did they analyze it? What choices did they make? That kind of a thing. And so that's generally how I structure class. And depending on the number of people that I have, we usually do that in groups. So I'll assign one question to a group of like 3 students, and every group will talk about the question that they have, and then we'll come back and talk about it as a class. And then this class is oriented towards a final research project. So they do a kind of scaled down research paper and a poster presentation for their final. And so the assignments that I have, in addition to the reading, are sort of scaffold them into that. So they have to pick articles on their own and summarize them, and then write a short like article critique. They turn in research questions, they turn in materials, and so forth. So while they're doing the content, they're also working on research projects of their own. So that's how I currently have the class structured, and that's a face-to-face class. Now, my experience, I don't have a lot of experience teaching online. I did the same scramble that many people did, probably most people did in March, to put my classes online. And this spring, I was teaching interlinguistics and syntax, both of which are more content-oriented and less discussion-oriented. But I think what I learned from those classes is, well, the way I did those classes is I went to asynchronous video lectures, and I did those in like brief 10, 12-minute videos followed by a quiz or something to respond to, and so forth. So I would keep that framework, probably, well, in part for using this book. But I think this book has some features that my books from the spring didn't have that would really support distance teaching. So I think our consider this boxes and our sort of follow-up discussion questions at the end of the chapter can be used both to provoke like as a sort of introduction to a like discussion board interaction, or as prep work for smaller group face-to-face, like synchronous over video discussions. But they're nice because you can tell students, hey, this is what our discussion is going to be about. I want you to prepare these 3 things so that you can come prepared, so that we can have a more structured discussion on WebEx or Zoom or whatever your video conferencing platform of choice is. I also think that one thing you could do well online in a way that I want to do more of in the classroom and never feel like I have time to is focus on kind of developing some of the writing skills that students need to write about research. So our exemplary study boxes, I think, provide a good model for what kind of information you should be looking for in a research article. And so you could ask students to use those to pull out important information from the articles that you assign. And you can have students do smaller writing assignments, like on a discussion board or something. And those could be used as prep for, again, a face-to-face like discussion. So, you know, like for instance, a lot of research findings are contradictory. So this would be a way to get people thinking critically about that. You could have, you know, okay, these researchers found this thing and they make this argument. These researchers found this thing and they make this argument. This set of students kind of works to, I don't know if defend is the right word, but works on this argument, and then this set works on this argument, and then you come together and try to talk about how to put the pieces together, or whether things are contradictory or whether they're just looking at different aspects of the same thing. I think that's all I have sort of thinking about in terms of introduction and some ideas about distance teaching. So for anybody who's new, I'm Megan Smith. We're talking about key questions in second language acquisition. If anybody has questions, that would be great. And I look forward to answering them. Oh, okay, that's an interesting question. So what is the right tool to use so as to measure syntactic complexity of L2 learners in writing? I will say that first of all, that's a good question. I am not a L2 writing scholar, although I have some familiarity with the L2 writing research. I think the complexity, I think, should be a combination of sort of structural and lexical complexity. So I would look at embeddings. I think number of words or mean length of utterance is probably too rough. But beyond that, it's been a long time since I've looked at this research, and I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer this question. Sorry. I think it's a good question. I just don't have a great answer to it. So another question is, do I have any advice for keeping students engaged? I have some ideas. I don't know if I do a good job on this. I think one of the things that worked reasonably well, I think, in my classes in the spring is that we'd already had, I don't know, roughly 2/3 of the semester by the time we went online. So they knew me, I knew them. If we're face-to-face from the beginning, that seems a little bit harder. I think the big thing, though, is there's two levels of engagement. One, there's just content engagement, but two, there's the interpersonal dynamic of teaching, which is sort of harder to quantify, but maybe more important for keeping students engaged in content. So one of the things I would consider doing if we are online again in the fall, and Mississippi State has not made a decision about that yet, so I don't know what my institution will be doing, but I think that personalizing it and with obviously some boundaries, but letting students know that you're a human being too helps, and so just helps make the material seem a little bit less intimidating. Like this stuff, this research, like introducing research can seem, in my experience anyway, intimidating to students. And so I have found that talking about my sort of personal experiences with some of this stuff, or personal examples for some of the stuff we're talking about, can help. And if I'm online in the fall, I think the first thing I'm going to do is record a personal introduction video to talk a little bit about myself and my background, and maybe ask students to do similar things, just so that, because engagement is also about like classroom community. And I think if students have they're comfortable with you as an instructor and they're comfortable with their classmates, they're more likely to be engaged in the material. The other thing I do, particularly when I teach this class, because it is demanding, it is difficult for students, is I talk to them a little bit about, I call it anti-fragile systems. So this idea that there are things that become stronger when they're taxed. So your immune system is an anti-fragile system. The skeletal muscular system is an anti-fragile system. And frankly, their minds and their learning is an anti-fragile system. So I talk explicitly about how I don't expect them not to struggle, and that it's okay to struggle, and that they can help me help them if, everybody's in this together. And so I just try to create this, like, look, we're all in this together kind of environment. And I don't know how well that would transfer online. I think that's really a challenge of online teaching. And if other people have suggestions, that would be great. I'd appreciate those suggestions, and you can comment or pop them in or something like that. Okay, here's another question. How do you address special needs learners without disturbing your other students? That's a good question. I think this is also a challenge. I've had various degrees of both experience and success with this. I think it depends a lot on the student. So depending on what you know and how it presents, I find it helpful to talk to the student about what they need and come up with kind of a separate sort of set of expectations. I've had students who take all of their quizzes in my office, for instance, because they have testing anxiety, but that's like a really easy thing to meet. I've also had students that are just like sort of disruptive in class, and that one's harder, particularly if you don't know what's going on with the student. I think ideally, again, without a specific context, this is a little bit harder, but the goal is to figure out how to meet the needs of whatever the special needs are, and meet the needs of everybody else in the classroom. And usually that means, I think, talking to the student about what they need and what will work for them, but also helping them understand, ideally, that you as the instructor are balancing everybody else's needs, and that sometimes their needs in the classroom have to be met outside of the classroom, and that you're willing to do that, but maybe ask them not to disrupt what you're doing in the classroom as a whole. I don't know. Again, I think this is really like situation dependent, and without an explicit situation, I'm not sure I can be more specific than that. All right, and here's the next question. Recently, I've been looking into grammar teaching in SLA. What are your thoughts on it? My personal standpoint is that we need a scaffold in order to make progress in the learning process. Therefore, structured instruction on grammar is needed. So I think there are a couple of different, I have a couple of different thoughts on this. One is that, like, okay, well, what does the research say about the role of explicit information and grammar instruction? And then a separate consideration sort of is, well, what helps learners feel comfortable? So I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with explicit grammar teaching, with a couple of major caveats. So first, in my reading of the research, there isn't evidence to suggest that explicit instruction can really change the underlying system. So the second language system, learners develop a second language mental representation by interacting with input. And we know that input is both necessary, or is necessary for second language acquisition. So that means that the most important thing you can do for learners is to provide them with language that is comprehensible and meaningful, and help them interact with it in a way that encourages them to get meaning out of it. Now, so that should be I think that's your primary focus in a classroom. Now, that said, there's a lot of context to language teaching that maybe sort of makes that difficult. So one of these contexts is a lot of language programs and a lot of state and national standards or high stakes tests test explicit grammar knowledge, which means, of course, then that you have to teach it, right? Because you're not doing students any favors if their test is going to be all on explicit grammar and you haven't taught them that. So that's one caveat. Another caveat is that I think that a lot of adult learners in particular have this expectation of what language learning looks like, and they want grammar rules. And so I see no problem with providing that kind of scaffolded grammar instruction, as long as it doesn't take the place of or really detract from this focus on meaningful interaction with input. And I think that another thing you can do is you can always pre-teach things and explain, like, okay, here are the things you're going to see, pay attention for these things. But I think you can also help learners understand that the mind just does what it does with language. And just because they understand something sort of consciously doesn't mean that the unconscious linguistic system can really take that in, because the system is abstract and implicit in a way that our grammar rules just don't capture. So if it helps people to feel comfortable engaging with the material, I think that that's great. I just think that you do everybody a favor if you don't assume that just because you taught something, learners have acquired it, because that's frustrating for everybody and not supported by the research. All right, next question. What factors do you think might make it easier or more difficult to learn L2 vocabulary items? Good question. I feel a little bit better equipped to answer this one than L2 or syntactic complexity measures. So I think Krashen's I+1 construct has gotten kind of a bad rap in the field because it's too hard to figure out what +1 means for input. But I think the biggest factor is how much vocabulary are you giving at a time? So learners, just from a working memory perspective, people in general can retain 3 or 4 items in working memory fairly easily. Any more than 7 is too much. And what that means from the standpoint of input is that if learners are trying to comprehend what you're providing them, most of it needs to be comprehensible. And that's a measure of what, where learners are at. So obviously you can have more complex input if you have higher proficiency learners. It seems from the evidence that some context alone, learners aren't generally good at just getting meaning from context, but a new vocabulary word with an explanation right next to it can be helpful. I think just memorizing lists is really hard. I think form meaning mappings are really where it's at. So if you have a list of L2 vocabulary and a list of L1 vocabulary, like that tends, I mean, that might work for like a test of some sort, but it tends not to stick. But if you have some kind of comprehensible, some way of building form meaning mappings where the meaning is central, that works better. So as just an anecdote, for instance, when I was in high school, I took French, and my AP French 5 class, we had vocabulary quizzes every week, and we would get a list of, I don't know, 40, 50 words at the beginning of the week, all by semantic sets. So I distinctly remember one list was types of trees, so maple trees, elm trees, oak trees, and so forth. And I was a good French student, but most of my French knowledge came from like just reading in French plus the classroom, plus I'd spent some time in French immersion contexts. And I really struggled with these vocabulary quizzes. And in fact, the only thing I remember from that is that the word for maple tree in French is l'érable. I think it's masculine, I don't remember. But I also read, while I was studying abroad in Japan, read all of, well, at the time there were only 4 Harry Potter books out, but the first 4 Harry Potter books in French. And I can tell you the word for magic wand in French because it comes up every other page in Harry Potter. And so I think what this comes down to is meaning, but you need to be careful that like you're allowing or providing a context in which learners can make mappings between what, like the form, the phonetic or phonological form of the word, and a meaning. So for instance, maple tree probably would have been easier if there was a short story about sugar maples in Vermont or something, or Quebec because of French context or whatever. But then that would have made maple tree a meaningful word for that, as opposed to just this vocabulary list. So I think that's all the time that we want to spend now. Thanks for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. If you have more questions, you can add them to the comments and I will respond. Hope you guys have enjoyed this, and thank you for your time.